Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to my final critique of Adam Key's paper, The American Nightmare: How Philip Brooks' Rhetoric Punked Professional Wrestling. First of all, I wanted to say that I love this topic, I love the paper, and I really think that mythic criticism is the way, or mythological criticism is the way to go with this. It was very, very interesting. And I really appreciated in the critique section, or the criticism section, how clear Adam's line of logic was. I have some thoughts on it, but overall, I felt like I really understood and saw the general direction that Adam was going. Before I dig in too much, I wanted to just mention a couple of minor writing notes. First of all, watch out for gender-exclusive language. At one point on page 4, you had the phrase, "As the viewer was left wondering whether he had heard from CM Punk," etc. APA in particular is really big on gender-inclusive or gender-neutral language. So just watch out. A simple fix would be he or she. That was the only one instance of that I saw, but just something to keep in mind in editing processes. And then secondly, for APA, be sure to always cite your articles in past tense. And what I mean by that is set up on page 5 really well. Kenneth Burke highlights the importance of mythological criticism in understanding a culture when he states, you have states as in present, be sure to do past tense, stated. AP is very, very grammatical in the way they like their citations, so because it was written in the past, these things are technically being said in the past. Therefore, you should say it in past tense. Say it was said in past tense, essentially. So, something to watch out for. I figured I would bring those up since this is a final paper that hopefully is going to be heading down the road toward publication. So, I think those are just some minor things that might hinder or slow down the publication process if you do end up having to publish in APA. So just minor things that I happened to pick up on that I wanted to bring up. So moving into the paper itself. First of all, I think mythological criticism was, again, a great choice for this, and I'm really, really glad that you justified it super well. Your justification for it on page 6 really kind of drove it home for me, where you cited Roland in 1990. Myths are stories which symbolically solve the problem facing the society, provide justification for a social structure, or deal with a psychological crisis. At first, I thought maybe this was going down the road towards class issues, and maybe that's something that can be considered in further papers with this. But your focus on favoritism and inequality is kind of going along that psychological line, and I think it was really, really interesting to dig into that and deal with that. Overall, the criticism was really, really good. The justification for your artifact, I think, needs a little bit of a boost, however. Couple of reasons why, and I'll explain them a little bit. First, you talked about, in your first point, the expansive reach of wrestling due to its the fact that it really doesn't have an off-season. Your ending sentence was, "This distinction is important for purposes of rhetorical analysis, as the constant propagation of new content gives professional wrestling an edge as they regularly expose viewers to their messages." I kind of see where you're going with that in terms of the edge, but I'm still left questioning what is that edge specifically. It doesn't really culminate to anything in particular. So I think that point is okay. It makes a lot of sense. But I feel like a slight wording change would just kind of start to drive that point home more and provide a little bit stronger justification. The biggest point that I had with this was your point on it being performed for a live audience as a justification for that rhetorical uniqueness and therefore worthy of study. I feel like what needed to happen here was it needed more scholarly support. That particular part of the justification was kind of lacking in the academic source area. Um, what you did have was a personal story, which is fine. I actually, when I do actual studies and not rhetorical criticism, I prefer autoethnography. But because the rest of your paper isn't set up that way, that part of it kind of really stood out, and it didn't match the overall tone or the method, if you will, for the rest of the paper or the rest of your contextualization. So it kind of stood out. What you could do, however, is create kind of a triangulation of that evidence or that justification by finding a scholarly source that talked about the audience role in sitcoms, because that's your comparison point, right? So what I would have done, if I can make this suggestion here, is to boost scholarly resource for this justification. Um, Look in media studies specifically. Look at sitcoms specifically. Some of the production features maybe, or how they tend to position the audience. That would be fine too. Something that gets at that comparison point that you were making. Then you could rely on the personal story aspect of it to create a stronger comparison, because your description of it was quite good. It was very descriptive and kind of put me in that place, and that's a good thing. So that kind of visceral description would serve as an excellent point of comparison to the scholarly article on this controlled sitcom area. Um, Basically, I just felt like the scholarly development on that was lacking, and so I had a hard time. I guess from a critical perspective, I understood what you were getting at, but I had a hard time buying it because it wasn't necessarily proven via previously published work. So just think about that whenever you see something that it's primarily a personal or analytical point. I would suggest always asking yourself, what's missing? Can I compare with something else? Somehow develop it from other academic resources. Um, okay. Overall, I thought your justification of the artifact was fine. I still bought it, but those two um, those were two hitches in the justification that I think need to be addressed before moving towards publication. Um, in terms of the rest of the paper, I want to start by saying everything you have included in the paper makes sense, and I understand why you are talking about it. However, from a structural perspective, it doesn't feel like it works. What happened when I was reading was it felt like there was too much setup for the criticism. What happened was your criticism or your setup, excuse me, your official setup point where you started providing discussion about the text and the context in particular, that started on page 9 and went all the way up through page 17. So by the time we got to the criticism, which started on page 17, 18 area, you had given us a lot of details about the whole situation, and those details were fascinating and interesting, and in the moment, I understood how they were important to your study, to your criticism. However, by the time we got to the criticism, I still remembered the gist of what you talked about, but lots of those details weren't there in my head anymore. And you threw a lot of necessary information at us, and that's a lot to process. So what I would suggest is consider a restructure. And I think what would happen is essentially you would have to provide those details in the act of criticism, but only give us the most basic concepts for background information in that contextualization phase. You did provide necessary amounts of context, so don't get me wrong on that. Don't skimp on that necessarily. But think about the fact that you might be able to get the same context, the same details out, just at a different point in the paper. So what I would suggest is, for that background information, for that setup, maybe find yourself a framework that limits what you are going to say. For me, whenever I need to really focus myself on setup, I tend to refer to Ralph Lloyd Bitzer's rhetorical situation, exigence, audience, and constraints. I feel like that would encompass a lot of the stuff that you talked about in the setup process. So that would help to limit you and provide kind of a framework for you to put for your background information. Then you can start your criticism and start weaving in more details into the criticism itself. And that way, it's almost like you have more concise, consolidated arguments for your paper. You argue for this particular uh, development of this new American dream myth. Here are the pieces of the evidence that back this up. Here's a piece of the text. Here's a piece of context. This is what's happening in the WWE overall in terms of the favoritism. So I think that those details are going to keep coming out again and again, but they have to be linked with what you're arguing in the first place. And, to criticize is to put forward an argument. You're arguing for a particular interpretation of the text. Not necessarily that it's right or wrong, but that it exists. So think about it in terms of argumentation. If you prove that it exists, you need to have those details in order to really develop that argument well. Okay. And honestly, right now, I feel like this would help to solve what I am perceiving to be essentially just a balance issue. Because all of your information is great, but when you essentially spent 17 pages, the first 17 pages were set up, and then 5 pages of the criticism. And I feel like that's just unbalanced. So more criticism with details, a little bit less full contextual setup, I think would help to balance your paper out a little bit more. In terms of the criticism itself, I thought it was great. Overall, I had nothing super big that I wanted to ask you about in that regard, in terms of the arguments you made. One thing that I was wondering about in terms of the development was that last point that you made about the impact the text had on the existing myth and society's belief in it. I wanted to ask you, or put forward an idea in your head. When you discuss the extension of the American dream, first of all, I love that point, and I think that you raise a valid argument about the interferers in the American dream. What I was curious about, though, is that when you discuss the American dream, what it is, you didn't bring up something that you brought up in the rest of your paper, the idea of a different and darker hero. That didn't seem to exist in the American dream literature that you talked about. It was more of a Brooks thing that developed. And so I was wondering if that is also a part of the new formulation of the American dream, or the extension of the American dream. I didn't really see it brought out that much more in that that last step, kind of that implication step of the mythological criticism, if you will. But you brought it up again and again in your paper, and I can't help but think, wow, that's super interesting that we're moving from what might be considered to be a general protagonist into kind of a tragic hero, someone who cannot overcome the weaknesses of their social hierarchy, of their structure. They're struggling to step up. So you may disagree with me. It may not be an important part of the extension of the American dream, and that's perfectly fine. But that was something that, since you brought it up multiple times, I couldn't help but wonder, is there something more to this that could be talked about in that 4th point? So the 4th point is good. You raised great points, but I can't help but wonder if that was a small part of it that could be discussed in the future. So with that being said, this was a good paper. I love the criticism. I love the information. I understand it. What I think would help, though, is a restructure to give you more criticism with deeper detail and a little bit less time developing the setup over the course of the paper. So thank you for a really great read, Adam. It was fascinating, and I look forward to hopefully seeing it in a journal sometime soon.